Good morning. Today I will talk about Chapter 1, New World Beginnings. As it states in your introduction to Chapter 1, about 16,000 years ago, the first humans will settle in North America. 10,000 years ago, the beginning of Western civilization and recorded history will begin in the Middle East in Mesopotamia and Egypt around 3500 to 3000 BCE. And it's only 500 years ago that the European explorers will arrive in the Americas. And it's not until 35,000 years ago that the Americas, which have been isolated from the rest of the world for millennia, will have contact with the rest of the world with the last great ice age. The last great ice age accounted for the origins of North America's human history because it exposed the land bridge connecting Eurasia with North America. And most likely, the first Americans were people who crossed the land bridge from Eurasia to North America 15 to 16,000 years ago. What happens is because of the great ice age, the world's oceans will drop 300 feet in ocean levels, and it will expose a land bridge called Beringia between Siberia and North America. And we will have bands of prehistoric people following large migrating herds of prehistoric animals crossing the land bridge into North America. And by the time of the arrival of the Europeans, the Native American peoples of the New World were divided into many diverse cultures, speaking more than 2,000 different languages. About 5,000 BCE, in Mesoamerica, the ancestors of the Maya will develop from a native grass, the plant what we call corn or maize. And the size and sophistication of the first Native American civilizations in Mesoamerica and South America can be attributed to the development of agriculture. And the first agricultural systems to develop will be in Mesoamerica. And that will give rise to the civilizations and civilizations of the Maya and then the Aztec and the Inca, which were both contemporary and existed when the Europeans arrived. The Maya, the Inca, and the Aztec civilizations had four common traits. They all had advanced agricultural practices based primarily on the cultivation of maize and potatoes, that's white potatoes, in the Andes, in the Inca Empire. They lacked the technology of the wheel and metal tools and weapons. They built elaborate cities and carried on far-flung economic commerce and had talented mathematicians which allowed them to make accurate astronomical observations. The Maya especially, who flourished from 300 to 900 AD or CE in the Yucatan Peninsula and what is Belize and Guatemala today. They were divided into city-states, and each prominent city-state in the middle of their city-state in a central location had a temple pyramid that served a dual purpose of performing religious ceremonies and sacrifices at the top, but at the same time, at night, they acted as observatories, and we will have Maya intellectuals and scholars trace the path of the heavenly bodies. And they will come up with the most accurate calendar at the time in the world at that time. It had the leap year, it was 365 and a quarter days. They also will develop a mathematical system based on 20, and they will have the concept of zero when medieval Europe is still using Roman numerals. North America is a much different scenario. Before the arrival of Columbus, most native peoples in North America lived in small, scattered, and permanent settlements. And when the Europeans arrived in both North America and Mesoamerica and South America, they found people of many distinct cultures who had used and altered the land in different ways. But in North America, one of the main factors that enabled the Europeans to conquer Native Americans with relative ease was the absence of dense concentrations of population or complex nation states in North America. So what was the basis of agriculture in the Americas? It's not wheat, it's not barley, it's not rice. It's maize or corn. And soon in Mesoamerica, the Maya civilization, will develop what is called a three-sister farming system of agriculture that will include maize, beans, and squash. Maize was the most nutritious of all the staple foods that humans grew throughout the world, and beans were nutritious as well, but they will regenerate the soil which the maize had depleted with nitrogen, and they will use the maize as a trellis so that its vines will go up the cornstalk. Squash was planted along with maize and beans because it ran across the ground and covered the soil so that weeds were not prevalent. And this was the status of the Americas when the Europeans arrived. In the southwest part of North America, we will have the Anasazi culture develop in the Four Quadrant region. The most prominent center of Anasazi culture is Chaco Canyon between Cuba and Bloomfield off the road to the south. And it will have the largest structure in North America, a 600 interconnected multi-storied apartment dwelling called Pueblo Bonita. But because of drought that will be extended in the late 13th century and early 14th century, the Anasazi culture centers will basically close their kivas and will abandon their sites and either go south or east into the Rio Grande. In central North America, at the same time, contemporary with the Anasazi civilization, we have the Mississippian culture centered at Cahokia, which had a population of 25,000. There's Pueblo Bonito today at Chaco Canyon. And here's an artist depiction of Cahokia at its height. They will build huge temples built of dirt called mounds, and some still exist today. And the great legacy of the Mississippian culture is that they will develop a superior strain of corn that will produce large amounts of food at northern latitudes, and they will be the first to use agricultural implements in that they will use flint hoes, and they will basically transmit that agricultural technology to the east all the way to the East Coast. All right. The foundation for the age of exploration and discovery by Western Europeans will begin in the Middle Ages. First, in the 10th and 11th centuries with the Vikings or Norsemen, who will basically cross the North Atlantic, and they will discover Greenland, and they will land in North America in what is Newfoundland today. They will call it Finland, and they will establish temporary settlements. This is Leif Erikson, who probably arrived in North America at Newfoundland around 1000 AD. But the early voyages of these Scandinavian seafarers did not result in permanent settlements in North America because no nation state was yearning to expand supported these adventures. There was no nation states yet who were organized and had enough money to support overseas exploration and colonization. But the true beginnings of European overseas exploration will occur a little later in the Middle Ages, from the 11th to the 12th centuries, in what we have the Christian Crusades. The Christian Crusaders were indirectly responsible for the start of European overseas voyages because they brought back news of valuable Far Eastern spices, drugs, and silks when they came into contact with Muslim merchants and traders in the Middle East. They will learn of the great wealth of Asia from Marco Polo as well as these Muslim traders. But the problem is the only way to get to China and the Far East by land route was through Muslim territory, and the Muslims were not going to allow Christians to do that. So basically they are blocked. But after the Christian Crusades end, Italian merchants for Genoa, Pisa, and Venice will dominate the luxury trade in Oriental goods in Western Europe, and they will basically purchase these goods from Muslim middlemen and take them back to the nobility and European elite in England, France, and Spain. And this is where the Europeans got their desire for silks and spices as well. The beginning of European overseas exploration will begin with the development of what is called a nation state. So a crucial political development that paved the way for European colonization of the Americas was the rise of the centralized national monarchies of first Portugal and then Spain. Here's Portugal on the west side of the Iberian Peninsula. But Portugal first moved south. But before it could engage in overseas exploration, it had to develop technology. And they will adopt technology from the Chinese and the Arab world that included the compass, the astrolabe, the lateen sail, which was a triangular sail that allowed European ships to combine both rectangular and lateen sails and were able to sail into the wind. As your book shows you, the great innovation of the Portuguese and Spanish is that they will develop ocean-going ships that can also bring back cargo and survive voyages in open waters. They will move down the west coast of Africa in search of a route to the east. In the 1440s, they will first land on the west coast of Africa, in this area right here. And there they will come into contact with Arabs and Africans who already are responsible for slave trading long before the Portuguese have arrived. But the Portuguese will soon engage in the slave trade, and they will be the first Europeans to engage in the slave trade. But they will not go inland and capture their own slaves, but they will only trade with Arab and African middlemen, slave traders themselves. And the reason they did that is during the Crusades, the other great product that the Europeans came in contact that originated in New Guinea and had traveled northwest over many centuries was sugar. And now, after the Crusades, the Italians will establish sugar plantations on the islands of Corsica, Sardinia, and Sicily, and move west to the Balearic Islands. And now they need new territory, new land to plant plant sugar that will become now a daily necessity of even the poorest Europeans. So Europeans wanted to discover a new, shorter route to East Asia in order to break the hold that Muslim merchants had on the trade with Asia, to reduce the price of Asian goods, to gain more profit for themselves, and reduce the time it took to transport goods. So in other words, they wanted direct contact with China the Moluccas, the Spice Islands, and India itself. They did not want to deal with the Muslim middlemen so that their profits would increase and the prices of these goods would go down. And monarchs from Portugal and Spain are the first to have the power and the authority and the wealth to basically support overseas exploration. And before 1500, 40,000 Africans were forced into slavery by both Portugal and Spain to work sugar islands on the Atlantic sugar plantations, on the Atlantic islands of the Azores, Madeira, Canaries, and Cape Verde. Here's Cape Verde, Canary, and Azores. Madeira is right here. All of them will be locations of intense sugar plantations where slaves who are now African instead of Slavic, they will now toil sunrise to sunset, planting, cultivating, and harvesting sugar that then needs to be processed into the granule material. But Portugal is not a part of the Americas in a great quantity because they will basically face south and then east. In 1488, Bartholomew Dias will discover that Africa is a peninsula, and 10 years later, Vasco da Gama will be able to sail around the tip of Africa, get a Swahili pilot on the east coast of Africa, and understand the monsoon winds that blow across the Indian Ocean and the Arabian Sea. And he will be the first European to reach India, and he will return in 1499, and he will come back with only one ship out of 5, but that one ship's cargo's value will be 60 times the cost of the expedition. Spain will only begin overseas exploration after they expel the last of the Muslim Moors in the southeastern kingdom of Granada in 1492, January and February. So Spain was united into a single nation state when the African Moors were expelled from Granada in January of 1492. And the momentum or impetus of Spanish exploration and pursuit of glory came from Spain's recent national unification and expulsion of the Muslim Moors. They needed to give their Hidalgo class something to do, and so that it did not cause trouble inside Spain itself. So in 1492, in August, Columbus has convinced Ferdinand and Isabella. He has traveled to several monarchies and has been rejected. Portugal, because they know that Africa is a peninsula that can be sailed around, and 2, Columbus has reduced the world's circumference by 1/4. But he convinces Ferdinand and Isabella that he can go to the latitude of the Cape Verde Islands, where he had lived for several years and studied the wind patterns, and that he would be able to cross the Atlantic and what they call the Ocean Sea, and eventually reach Japan and China itself and the East Indies. So he will leave in August, and within 6 weeks he will reach and arrive in the West Indies. He will return 3 more times, and on the second voyage he will begin what is called the Columbian Exchange, when he will bring 1,200 men in 11 ships, and they will establish the first Spanish colony on the island of Hispaniola. After Columbus's rediscovery of the Americas, this will establish the basis for the emergence of a new interdependent global economic system. We think we have a global system. A global system of economic trade has existed since Columbus's voyages. Europe will provide the markets, technology, and capital. Africa will provide the labor, unfortunately. The New World will provide its raw materials, especially its precious metals and fertile soil. And there will be an advancement and improvement of technology by both the Spanish and the Portuguese, as I discussed beforehand. Why did Spain and Columbus go west? Well, Spain looked westward because Portugal controlled the southern route along the west coast of Africa. Who becomes the conquistadores? You have to realize that for centuries, in what's called the Reconquista, there will develop a Hidalgo class. And because of centuries of military and religious confrontation, the Hidalgo class will be a large class of men obsessed with status and honor. It will breed religious zealotry and intolerance, and it will create a class who regarded manual labor and commerce or business with contempt. This comes from the Makers of America, the Spanish Conquistadores pages. Men became conquistadores because they wanted to gain God's favor by spreading Christianity. They also wanted to gain glory in the hopes that if they are a commoner, they will become a noble, escape dubious past, seek adventure as the heroes of classical antiquity, and more than anything else, they were looking for gold. The phenomenon that begins with the second voyage of Columbus is called by historians the Columbian Exchange. Well, if I can find the map. There it is. The term Columbian Exchange describes the transfer of plants, animals, and diseases between the Old and New Worlds. The introduction of New World plants around the world will result in a rapid growth throughout the Old World. Among the most important American Indian products or discoveries to spread to the Old World, which is Africa, Asia, and Europe, all three continents knew of the other's existence, were foodstuffs such as corn, beans, manioc, which is cassava or tapioca, if you know tapioca, and potatoes, both white and sweet. Perhaps 3/5 of the crops cultivated around the globe today originated in the Americas. Native New World plants such as tobacco, maize, beans, manioc, and white potatoes revolutionized the international economy as well as the European diet, feeding the rapid population growth of the Old World. Ironically, the introduction into West Africa of New World foodstuffs like maize, manioc, and sweet potatoes may have fed an African population boom that numerically, though not morally, more than offset the losses inflicted by the slave trade. Remember, the Portuguese will be the first Europeans to engage in the African slave trade. They did not begin it. It already existed across North Africa, across the Sahara Desert, in the persons of Arab and African slave traders. But they will now bring slaves across the Atlantic to the Americas, first going to the islands off the northwest coast of Africa to grow sugar on sugar plantations. On Columbus's second voyage, as I was talking about, he will return to Hispaniola. He will find that the 30 to 40 men he had left behind are gone. He will unload 1,200 men from 17 ships that will also carry pigs, cattle, and horses. Horses will transform North America because within 2 centuries, the horse, mainly through Mexico, will reach the Great Plains of North America, and horses would transform the Sioux, the Apaches, and the Blackfeet peoples into highly mobile, wide-ranging hunter-warrior societies that roamed the grassy Great Plains in pursuit of huge herds of buffalo or bison. Also, Columbus will introduce on his second voyage to the Caribbean sugar, and a sugar revolution will subsequently take place in the European diet. Fueled by the forced migration of millions of Africans to work the cane fields and sugar mills of the New World, now even the poorest Europeans can afford to consume sugar. But the most ominous element of the Columbian exchange will be diseases. Europeans carry the germs that cause smallpox, yellow fever, measles, and malaria, and Old World diseases quickly devastated the Native Americans. European contact with Native Americans led to the deaths of millions of Native Americans who had little resistance to European diseases because they had been isolated from the rest of the world for millennia. So the primary reason for the drastic decline in Native American population after their encounter with the Europeans was the Native Americans' lack of resistance to European diseases such as smallpox, malaria, and measles. Now, the great element of the Columbian exchange for the New World is the arrival of livestock, not just the horse, but of cows, goats, and sheep. There are no livestock. There are no domesticated animals in the New World. In North America, the beast of burden is the dog. In Central America, many Native American families keep turkeys mainly for food and for the feathers to use in religious ceremonies. What happens is that without natural resistance to Old World sicknesses, Indians will die in droves. Within 50 years of the Spanish arrival, the population of the Taino natives in Hispaniola will go from 1 million to about 200. And by the early 1600s, the Native Americans of the Caribbean islands are extinct. Now, add to this enslavement and armed aggression for the quick and steep decline of Native American peoples, but the deadliest killers were microbes, diseases, mainly smallpox, measles, and influenza. In the centuries after Columbus's landfall, as many as 90% of Native Americans perished, a demographic catastrophe without parallel in human history. The depopulation was not surely intended by the Spanish, but it was nevertheless so severe that entire culture and ancient ways of life were extinguished forever. Perhaps it is poetic justice that the Indians unintentionally took revenge by affecting the early explorers with syphilis, injecting the lethal sexually transmitted disease for the first time in Europe. And sailors on Columbus's voyages will be the first Europeans to bring back syphilis from the Americas. And before the end of the 1500s, syphilis has traveled along the Silk Route across Eurasia into China. Okay, this brings us to Cortez. Cortez will leave the island of Cuba with a substantial expedition of men, a few horses, and several ships, and they will pick up a Spanish castaway off the coast of Cozumel, who will know the Mayan language, and soon after they will capture a Native American slave that not only knows the Maya language, but the language of the Aztecs. He will then land on the east coast of Mexico, near present-day Veracruz, and there he will meet many different Native American groups who are under the rule of the Aztec Empire. And they want to throw off that rule because of tribute. Tribute in the form of goods and materials, but also they have to send their own people every year so that these people can become human victims of sacrifice, because the Aztecs believed in their religion and theology that the only way for the sun to continue in its orbit was to be fed human blood. So he will use this hatred of Native American groups on the east coast of Mexico, and instead of attacking and destroying the Spaniards and the Native Americans will become allies, and he will march with 20,000 allies inland towards Tenochtitlan, which was a city of 300,000 inhabitants, situated on Lake Texcoco on islands that were connected by huge causeways. The Spanish will be in awe when they go through a mountain pass and first see Tenochtitlan. The Aztec chief Montezuma had heard of their impending arrival, and he will allow Cortez and his troops to enter Tenochtitlan because he believed that Cortez might be the Aztec god Quetzalcoatl, whose return was to be in the same year, 1519, as Cortez's arrival on the east coast of Mexico. And what made it even more a possibility is that Quetzalcoatl in Aztec theology was a fair-skinned god. They will enter Montezuma and will be treated very courteously, but their golden appetite for gold is so immense that they will soon be forced from Tenochtitlan. In the summer of 1520, and as a result, it's called the Noche Triste, June 30th, 1520. The Aztecs had had enough, and now after this, Cortez and his allies, Native American allies, will lay siege to the city, and they will enter in August of 1521, preceded by a devastating smallpox and measles epidemic that basically will see thousands of Aztecs lying on the streets and causeways of Tenochtitlan as the Spaniards and their Native Americans entered the city. And this will lead to the destruction of Tenochtitlan and the Aztec Empire, and on its ruins, the Spanish will establish Mexico City, but Lake Texcoco, they will build it on the dry lake bed of Lake Texcoco. And the native population of Mexico will shrink from some 20 million to 2 million people in less than a century, mainly due to the devastating effects of European diseases. In 1532, Francisco Pizarro and even a smaller force of Spaniards will leave Panama and travel into the Inca Empire that's along the west coast of South America, in Peru, as well in the Andes. And he will quickly defeat the Inca Empire because it is in political uproar and civil war because of the advance of a smallpox epidemic that basically upset the succession to the throne. As a result, the Spanish will acquire immense amounts of gold, silver, and other priceless materials. But gold and silver, but mainly silver, it will come in huge quantities to Europe. And like your book says, some historians call this the price revolution, because the flood of precious metal from the New World to Europe as a result of the conquest of the Aztecs and the Inca, and then the later discoveries of huge amounts of silver at San Luis Potosi in Bolivia and northern Mexico, it will be responsible for a huge increase in European money supply. It will facilitate the growth of capitalism as an economic system. It will cause the spread of commerce and banking, and it will lay the foundations of the modern commercial banking system. After the conquest of the Aztec and Inca empires, Spain will now look north, and we have Ponce de Leon, we have Coronado, and we have De Soto. Explore different parts of North America, but all have the same outcome. None will find gold, and for 50 years the Spanish will basically ignore North America because in the first exploration they will not find any gold. St. Augustine will be established in eastern Florida to protect from the encroachments of the French and English and to protect Caribbean sea lanes. Because of the legend of the seven cities of Cibola, you will have Don Oñate go up the Rio Grande Valley from New Spain or northern Mexico, but he as well will find no silver, no gold, but only discover the Grand Canyon and the Colorado River, and will be the first European to see the massive herds of buffalo because he will travel as far as Kansas. But the Spanish will return, they will remain, and their chief goal is missionary work, not economic work. And throughout the 1600s, the Pueblo Indians, who are basically the descendants of the Anasazi in their legend and mythology and history, they will have to play off the Spanish government and the Spanish Church, Catholic Church, and its Franciscan missionaries, one against the other. Then in the 1670s, the church and the state will basically come together as allies, and now their goal is to suppress and destroy all Native American customs and religious traditions. This will lead to the Pueblo Revolt of 1680, in which the Pueblo Indians, which there are many different groups, many different pueblos, they will unite and take common action for the first time in their history against the Spanish. And it's led by a religious leader from one of the pueblos who had been whipped and jailed by the Spanish authorities a few years earlier, Pope. And the Pueblo Indians and the Pueblo Revolt will rebel because Spanish missionaries sought to suppress and destroy all Native American religious customs and traditions. They will go into the pueblos themselves and destroy their kivas. In retaliation, the Pueblo peoples will organize a rebellion, even though it will be discovered a day or two before. They will kill hundreds of Spanish settlers. They will kill almost 20 to 30 Spanish priests, Franciscan priests, and they will destroy every Catholic church in the province of New Mexico and then desecrate it. And as a last humiliation, Pueblo Indians will build a ceremonial religious chamber, a kiva, on the ruins of the Spanish Plaza. So why had the Spanish settled in Florida and New Mexico, and then in the early 1700s, even in Texas, when there was no gold to be had? Well, Spain began to fortify and settle its North American borderlands in order to protect its land, its silver mines in Central and South America from encroachments by the English and the French.